Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to Quest Live, our leadership broadcast podcast where we talk to teachers, mentors, coaches about raising strong young leaders. And I'm excited that you joined me here today on this particular episode as we begin a conversation. We're going to start a conversation today, obviously, in our world, that this is top of mind for all of us today here in America. And that is the topic of racism. We're going to talk today about the idea of racism and starting a conversation with your students, I want to talk a little bit today about this from a broad perspective. I want to start with just a high level view. And over the coming weeks, we're going to drill down a little bit more into this topic, hopefully with some guests that we can kind of talk through a little bit on this, but there's some basic things today that I wanted to kind of just speak to from a coaching perspective. I want to say at the very outset that I do not consider myself an expert on this particular topic, the topic of racism. But from a coaching perspective, I want to bring some points of view of how we can go about starting this conversation and why it matters that we would start this conversation with our students. So I want to say thank you for joining me here today, for jumping on the podcast here. I'm excited that you're tuning in. Take a quick second, if you would, and share this out. This conversation is going to be an important conversation. So let's share this out. Let's get others involved in it. If you're a teacher, if you are a mentor, if you are a coach, if you have influence in the life of the development of a young student, then this is for you. And that's what this podcast is all about. Also want to encourage you before we jump into the topic here for today to go ahead and like our Facebook page, our Quest Student Leadership Facebook page. We'd love for you to like that. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe and click the bell. And that way you can keep up to date on when we go live with new broadcasts, new content, as we are constantly creating content and opportunities for people to learn and grow and their ability to raise a strong next generation. It's what we're all about here. We've written books, journals, have an entire system that is used to help young students, we're talking about elementary age students, get a handle on what it means to build strong character, to self-navigate, set their own and achieve their own goals, and to learn to use their influence, true leadership, use their influence for the good of others. And so our whole system is based on helping these kids at an early age build these skills and abilities, this way of thinking. And so a part of what we also do, which we feel is one of the most important things that we do, is to provide opportunities like this to help coaches grow in their skill and ability in doing the same thing. So we're going to talk today real quickly just about a few points I want to share with you on the idea of starting a conversation with your students about racism, why it matters, why the conversation must continue to go on. And then in coming weeks, we're going to talk about practical steps, things that we can do. So today I want to begin with just this idea of starting the conversation. So a few points I want to kind of just bring to light here, and feel free to screen capture these if you'd like to. Go back and watch this again as it gets posted here to Facebook Live. But a few things that I want to encourage you in where it concerns this topic, because I recognize that for some of us, this topic can be difficult. For all of us, it's difficult. But what I mean by difficult is that for some of us, it may not feel natural. There may be an awkwardness about talking about the idea of racism, born out of maybe you feel like you don't have experience or knowledge or a complete understanding. Maybe for you, it's too emotional. It's too close to home, and it's hard for you to bridge the gap into a conversation that is helpful for others without becoming too impassioned about it. So, for all of us, we're coming from a different perspective on the idea of racism. And so I just want to speak to just a few simple points about this to empower you for the next steps in this journey. Let me begin by saying that is critically important that you have the conversation. It's critically important that you have the conversation, that you make time for it, that you lean into resources, that you invite others into the conversation, and so on, because our kids need to talk about this. We want them to develop healthily in this perspective. It's important that they have a right perspective about this, else this gets perpetuated. If we want to stop the flow of racism in humankind, it begins at this level. It begins when we are kids and addressing some of the mindsets and thoughts and perspectives that go in to this topic. And so we have an opportunity and a window to have an incredible effect on the future, because we are directly coaching, mentoring, teaching young students, not future leaders, today leaders that will continue to lead into the future. And so if we want our 18-year-olds and our 24-year-olds to act appropriately, we begin that training when they are 5, 6, 9, 12. And so that's what this is all about, is empowering me and you with some thoughts, some ideas about how we can approach this topic with confidence. But number one is just make sure you do it. You've got to find a way to do it. Spend some time, prepare, get ready. And so that's what I want to talk to you about right now. So what are some practical things that you can do to build confidence? And what are some foundational things that are important to the conversation? That's really all I want to talk about today. So I want to go through a few of those points here very quickly. Number one, the first thing that we must do is we must acknowledge for ourselves that racism is real, it exists, and it's real. We recently were a part of a rally in our community, and this was a peaceful rally, a protest against racism. And one of the things that we had heard in leading up to the protest was that there was some chatter about the idea that in our community, the thought was, it doesn't exist in our community. Why is there a protest? So racism doesn't exist in our community. Why is there going to be a protest? And I get that some people may feel that way. Some people may feel like, I don't see it, I don't experience it, I don't hear it, and the list goes on. So therefore, it doesn't exist. It's not real. But the truth is that just because you and I may not feel it, we may not see it, you may not see it, you may not have experienced it, certainly does not mean that it's not real. And so the first step to having a healthy conversation with our students is acknowledging the fact, the undeniable fact. This is not up for debate. This is fact. The fact is that racism exists and it's real. What does that mean? What's the difference between the two? Number one, it exists. Number two is that it's a part of reality. That word real is just short for reality. It's a part of reality. You know, there are things that exist that aren't a part of a person's reality. And then there are things that exist that are a part of our reality. Racism is both. It exists and it's a part of our reality. And so we have to acknowledge that. We have to find a way to. Now, if that's hard for you to acknowledge immediately, and maybe you have questions, you go, well, how will I know? How can I be convinced? What I encourage you to do is go ask some questions, go have some conversations, go do a little bit of research, spend some time digging into it. All the skeptical questions that you might have, work hard to get them answered, but go after them, because when you can acknowledge that it exists and it's real, that's the beginning of being able to equip then others, especially young students that are under your influence, that you're leading, teaching, coaching, mentoring. And so number one, we have to acknowledge that it's real and that exists. Number two, we have to educate ourselves on facts, not cliche. On facts, not cliche. So there are things that are true about racism that you'll only learn by digging in and educating yourself, by doing the research yourself, reading the articles yourself, having the conversations with people who have experienced the impact of racism personally. sitting across from them. And honestly, I believe that one of the best ways to do that is the same way that we want to build with our students, and that is to have a very open and a vulnerable conversation. I would recommend against sitting across from someone who is going to be contentious about the conversation. In other words, maybe they just want to make a point. Maybe they're so impassioned about it that they can't clearly speak objectively or help you understand. Because the point of having those conversations for you is to grow in your understanding. There may be a level of the convincing that you need, that the passion that they bring to the conversation is going to help with. But ultimately, there are things that you need to know about racism so that you're equipped to speak from a place of influence as you begin to have this conversation with your students. That's why it's so important to get the facts. And I highly recommend doing that with people that you trust, having those conversations with people that you trust so that you can openly and vulnerably have the conversation without judgment and so that you can gain the most knowledge from it. On the cliche side, I can't tell you how important that cannot express to you how important not leaning on cliche is. And here's why. Because when you speak from cliche, now this is true in general, this is a principle. It applies in every situation, and it certainly applies to the conversation about racism. When you speak from cliche, so what's cliche? Well, the word cliche actually comes from a French word. It's a French word that actually means click, and it's an onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like the word that what it's describing. So like boom or splash or those kinds of things. Those words they're verbal. When you verbalize them, they embody the thing you're trying to describe. Like splash is a splash, and that's the sound the splash makes. Cliche is that same type of word. It's the click of the pressing in the letter, and it's cliche. And with cliche now in our current vocabulary means it means something that is commonly known, but specifically not necessarily powerful. In other words, cliche is almost come to mean nonsense, or what you say when you don't know what else to say. It's cliche, right? There, I could go into a list of what those things mean. The point of this is that when we say cliches, especially to young students, especially the students that we're mentoring, leading, coaching, teaching, when we use cliches, they're received as fact. They're received as authority. The last thing that we want to do is, especially on a topic like this, with serious implications, the last thing we want to do is to use cliche as a final authority. Cliche as a final authority. I'll give you an example of a cliche. So maybe you're encouraging a kid that's having a difficult time struggling in an area. And so the cliche may be, hey, just keep trying hard. You've got this. That's cliche. It's encouragement, but it's cliche. There's really nothing in that to act on. It's just empty words that sound positive, but there's really nothing there to gain traction with. That's cliche, the idea of cliche. So when you use cliche on topics like racism, it actually can perpetuate a lack of traction in getting us to move forward out of a racist society. It can keep us locked into racism because that cliche has no power to it. It has no traction ability. So you got to educate yourself on the facts and then speak factually. Speak from facts and not cliche. It might do you good to go do some research on cliches, racism cliches, and be aware of what they are so that you don't fall into the trap of leaning on them and using them. But stick to facts, stick to things that you can get traction on in helping to advance the thinking and the habits of the next generation where it concerns this idea. Number 3 is to ask questions and listen. I cannot tell you how important this is either. When we're not versed on a topic, now maybe you come from a place of expertise, so to speak. You have personal experience. You've dealt a lot with this issue. You've talked it out. You have strong talking points. You have strong points of action that students can take. You know how to lead them forward in the conversation. Then certainly you can drive the narrative in a greater way. But what asking questions does for us is it unlocks what's on the inside of the students that we then get to address directly. I saw a quote yesterday, and this is something that I completely agree with. And that is that as leaders, we are often answering questions nobody's asking. In other words, we'll get on our stump speeches and we'll go on and on and on about things, and we'll speak passionately about a topic, and the audience is just glazing over. They're just lost. Why? Because we're answering questions nobody's asking. The best way to provide an answer is to first be clear about the question. And the way we're clear about the question is to ask questions. Asking questions draws to the surface the thing that is inside that needs resolved for those that we're interacting with. So you got to ask questions. And in fact, I would encourage, especially if you jump into conversation with your students soon about this topic, that you ask questions almost primarily, just questions. What are you thinking? How does this impact you? What's your perspective? What would you have done in that situation? What do you believe is another way to go about this? How does it make you feel when you see this? How does it make you feel when you hear this? You're mining for the thought processes and the gold that's inside the thinking of your young students, because it's from that perspective that you can then can begin to engage them in answers. But the second half of asking questions is actually listening. It's listening. And it's a skill. Listening is a skill. It is not hard at all for our minds to drift. It's not hard at all for us to get distracted in our own thought processes and not even hear the response. So the first thing that we have to do is listen, but not just listen surface. We've got to listen to the answer behind the answer, the answer behind the answer. What's the next question? The question behind the question. What's the next question that we need to ask to keep digging further into that? So you ask the question, how does that make you feel? A kid expresses and says, it makes me feel angry. What do you mean by angry? Describe angry for me. What is that? What do you mean? They describe anger. Inside that description of anger are going to be key thoughts and concepts and ideas that you can ask questions about. That is active listening. You're actively listening to what's being said and looking for handles and truth in there so that you can then bring the information that you've used to educate yourself with to help them grow in their education and their perspective on the topic, and that topic being racism. And so we begin by educating ourselves, acknowledging, hey, it's real, it exists. I'm going to educate myself in this. I'm going to take some time, not just gathering articles and data, but talking it out with people that maybe have experienced it, getting some insights and perspectives, allowing yourself to be open to what that means, and then sitting down to start asking questions, gathering the information of what's on the mind of your students so that you can fashion a response that's not cliche, but that's actionable and tractionable, which brings me to number 4, and that is this: to look for action steps. One of the things that we've heard in this conversation, the current conversation, I've even used the term over recent days, I use the term recent events. And I want to be very clear that these recent events are not standalone events. They're repeated events. This is another version of, and in a lot of ways, the same exact version of what we've seen in the past. So we've seen these things happen before. We've seen the atrocities. We've seen the reaction. We've heard the narrative about needing to expunge our society of racism. We must once and for all get rid of racism. And the truth is That's a narrative that's been going on for decades, if not centuries. And so while in some respects, progress has been made in some respects, it's obvious that not enough progress by any stretch has been made. There's more yet to do, a lot more yet to do. And so we can't allow ourselves to rest in just the conversation. We can't allow ourselves just to be satisfied with the fact that we sat down with our kids and talked about it, that we had an open conversation about racism with our students. We can't be satisfied with that. It has to break down to conversation. Every plan must eventually devolve into hard work, or it's just a dream. So we have to find and look for, okay, what are we going to do? What's going to be different? If you're a part of the Quest system and you lead a Quest student leadership team, you're asking yourself the question, how are we going to incorporate this thinking and these steps into what we're actually going to do? What's going to be different about our team? What's going to be different about our interaction? What's going to be different about our language? How are we going to perpetuate a non-racist dialogue, a non-racist environment? How do we do that? And it has to break down. You've got to look for action steps. List those out clearly, and then put them through the process, the tools that you have in your hands through the Quest system that you know very well of how to set out goals and to watch your progress against those goals, using the MAP system to create those goals and follow them, and especially doing that with your students. So I just want to just encourage you with these 4 simple tools and thoughts that we, first of all, acknowledge it exists, it's real. Second of all, that we educate ourselves on the facts, not the cliches. Third of all, that we determine to ask questions and listen, and then we look for action steps and we take those action steps. If you'll follow these 4 steps and you'll seriously dig into the idea of racism and what we can do to take action against it, we will begin to see some traction. And that's what we need. We need the dialogue, we need the passion, but we need the action. We've got to take some steps that we can actually measure progress and see a difference. So I want to encourage you today, have that conversation, have it, get it set up, have it. And these are some things that you can do, hopefully encourage you in that process, and stay tuned for future conversations on this topic and many more like it. Because we're all about empowering coaches, teachers, leaders, mentors as they coach young leaders. So I hope that's helpful for you today. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. Thanks for jumping on with me today as we've talked about this very important topic. Definitely, if you haven't had a chance to yet, go on and be a part of what we're doing. Make sure you stay tuned, hit subscribe so that you're alerted on what's going on Facebook and YouTube. And most of all, man, we just appreciate your encouragement. We're serious about this work. We want to do it right. We are praying for you. We're praying for the next generation. So stay strong and keep raising strong young leaders.